by Laura from the Students' Union, and Laura will be in charge of the Student Union's Accommodation Advisory Service this year, which runs for a few months at the start of the year, and she'll have lots of great advice for you. We're also joined by my colleagues, Michelle Hogan, who is the manager of the Global Room and the International Student Liaison Officer, and also by the assistant manager of the Global Room, Abby Odikeya, who you will probably also know from the Global Room. And we will also then have 2 student ambassadors from the Global Ambassador team. Mark Escoto has just joined us, and we will have another ambassador joining later on for a Q&A period. So we're going to kick off then. To begin with, the order that we're going to go in is that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Trinity provided accommodation for undergraduates and postgraduates, and what particularly what is available at the moment, what the accommodation will look like, particularly in the context of the restricted movement and social distancing procedures that will be in place. And then we'll move into Stephen's presentation then, and then we'll move into Laura's presentation, and then we will have a Q&A and some guidance from our 2 student ambassadors, Tanmay and Mark. So, and you'll be able to answer questions at that point. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen now. Just give me a moment.
If you have any questions during the presentation, you'll find a Q&A box just there at the bottom of the screen. If you just click on that and type in your question, and we'll review them at the end.
Having a slight problem sharing my screen, but just one moment.
And for the Q&A at the end with the ambassadors, we'll actually have 3. Mark's going to help us with some questions, and then one of our ambassadors has been in our kind of Trinity accommodation, and another has kind of helped source external accommodation for himself and for others.
You should be starting to see my slides now. Is that working? There you go. Okay, just one moment. Now, I know you can't see me, just one second. Yeah. Okay, everyone, sorry about that slight delay. So, as I said, I'm Louise. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about accommodation at Trinity. So, there are 3 chief accommodation sites that Trinity can offer you that would be suitable for undergraduates and postgraduates. So, I'm going to talk you through some of them. Now, we also have to bear in mind that some of these accommodation deadlines have closed, but I will also give you some information on what the procedures will be around physical distancing and supports and things like that if you are staying in those accommodation sites. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Trinity Hall. Now, Trinity Hall is only for first-year undergraduates. There is also Kavanagh Court, which is available for all years of students, and that's a 15-minute walk from Trinity. I'll show you some slides on that in a moment. Kavanagh Court, I understand, is already almost fully booked, but I think there are still some places available. So I have given details on how you do that further on in the presentation. Binary Hub is also open to all years of applicants. Now, previously it wasn't, but this year it is. So if you are interested in applying to Binary Hub, there are still rooms there for anyone, whether they are a UG or PG. So what will accommodation look like at Trinity this year? Well, Trinity is planning to safely reopen its accommodation for the new year, but it will be obviously in the context of social distancing protocols, which will be essential to maintain everybody's health at this time in the context of COVID-19. So what is the advice for anyone, for example, an international student who's arriving to Ireland? And I know not everyone attending this webinar at the moment will necessarily be an international student. Some of you will be local students. So this advice won't necessarily apply to you, but I just want to mention it, that if you are an international student or anyone who is arriving from outside of Ireland to Trinity, you must restrict your movement for 14 days after you arrive. So what does that mean? It means staying at home. It means only going out for essential supplies or for small amounts of exercise. So you will be given further advice on that over the coming weeks from Trinity. But supports will be in place to assist you during those 14 days, and that will include options like food delivery, other supplies, and also supports for health and well-being. Now, there will be more information on the Accommodation Office website and also in the FAQ section of our coronavirus webpage, which you'll see listed below. So Trinity Hall, for those of you who are first year undergraduates, you may have already applied. Also for any CAO students, this is the place that a lot of CAO first years will stay in. Trinity Hall is located in Dartry in South Dublin. It's 4 kilometres away from the main campus and well served by bus and by Lewis. It's also within walking distance of Trinity. It's about a 45-minute walk. So what you get there are ensuite bedrooms. You'll see an example there of a study room. And ensuite means that you have your own bathroom facilities as part of your room. Each student then, having their own room, then shares a kitchen and living space as well. And there are laundry rooms and other recreational rooms on campus, on the main campus in Trinity Hall. So the important thing to note is if you've applied to Trinity Hall already, either as, if you've applied as a CAO student, you're probably awaiting a notification of whether you've got a room, and you won't get that until a later point, until the actual Leaving Cert results and the CAO results are out. For international students, you may have already received confirmation of your room because the application procedure is different. If you have not applied for Trinity Hall, unfortunately, it is closed now. There's no further applications being accepted. There are 1,000 rooms in Trinity Hall though, and so it is quite a mix of international and domestic students. Kavanagh Court is still open for applications, but as I said, filling fast. That is located in the city centre. It's about a 15-minute walk from Trinity. It is very nice, it's purpose-built student accommodation, and Stephen from Threshold is going to talk to you a little bit more about purpose-built accommodation during his presentation. Undergraduates and postgraduates can apply for this site. It is not a site that is owned by Trinity. Trinity leases it from a supplier or from an accommodation provider. So some of the rules and regulations around Kavanagh Court are a little bit different than in Trinity accommodation. But you can certainly apply through the Trinity site if you're interested in that as an option. Similarly, Binary Hub is a privately operated accommodation site, purpose-built student accommodation, but managed, applications are managed through Trinity also. It is still open for application, so if you are interested in applying, I would advise you to do so fairly soon. Again, these are single ensuite rooms, very nice accommodation, and it's located about a 20-minute walk from Trinity, just off Thomas Street. And has been working very well for students who've stayed there. So what is the accommodation advice then for Trinity students if you're staying in one of the Trinity sites? Well, as I mentioned, social distancing protocols will be in place, and students are expected to adhere to those protocols for everyone's safety, including their own. There will be advice given to all students on how to clean your shared kitchens and your living rooms, and there will be very much an emphasis on personal responsibility, which is really important for you all to note. As the government advice is saying here, but also globally, we're all in this together. It's very important that everyone takes responsibility for maintaining their own health and the safety of others. There will be regular professional cleaning as well of common shared areas and any common touch points in buildings. And all students in Trinity accommodation will have to watch mandatory online health and safety videos before they come to their accommodation. So as I mentioned, if you are a new arrival to Ireland and you're coming from overseas, you will have to restrict your movement for 14 days. There is a plan across all of the Trinity sites to invite international students to arrive early to move into accommodation where feasible, to allow them to have that 14 days before the orientation period begins. And the orientation period is beginning on slightly different dates, either the 21st if you're a new or if you're a continuing student, or on the 28th if you're a new first year student. So the orientation dates are a little bit different for each group at the moment. There will also be a staggered arrival period as well to ensure that students are not all arriving and trying to move into accommodation at the same hour on the same day, because that would not facilitate social distancing. For example, in Trinity Hall, students will be placed in the bedroom that they will continue to stay in for the rest of the year, which will just help with maintaining just that consistency and so that people are not moving into another room that has to be cleaned then. Students are also being advised to make sure that you have sufficient personal effects, personal toiletries, clothes, clean clothes, medicines, etc. for that 2-week period as well. Because as I said, your restricted movement period will mean that you will only be able to go out for essential reasons. And so you need to bear that in mind. Where Trinity Hall is concerned, you can order a kitchen and bed linen pack from the accommodation office before you arrive in college, and Trinity Hall will be communicating with you on that as well. So what other supports will be provided during the restricted movement period? In Trinity Hall, there will be a welcome pack with basic food and cleaning materials that will be provided for free. The plan is also to offer a daily meal delivery service for students to purchase. So that would be 3 meals a day, for example, for €25. And there would be a designated collection point on site. And that's just to assist people to make sure that during the restricted movement period, they're not having to go out on a regular basis to the supermarket. There will be dedicated supports to help anybody who has any mental health needs during that time, and also health supports in case anyone does feel ill for any reason, but also if they perhaps have symptoms of COVID-19. And then there'll be on-the-ground support for other reasons also. So you may have questions on what additional supports are available, or what other things you need to bear in mind. Trinity is getting a lot of questions, and I'm sure Laura from the Accommodation Advisory Service will also be getting these kinds of questions. We're getting lots of questions from students about whether or not their parents, their family, or their friends, or whoever is accompanying them to Ireland can stay with them on their arrival in Trinity accommodation. Unfortunately, that cannot be accommodated because obviously there are limitations on the amount of accommodation we have, and we cannot have additional people staying in the accommodation at this time. So therefore, if you're assigned Trinity accommodation, you should move into that accommodation, and we recommend that anyone who may be accompanying you who is also coming with you from overseas will also have to restrict their movement for 14 days or find alternative accommodation to ensure that we are complying. Now, we understand that there will be communications in the coming days as well for students who are not currently planning to stay in Trinity accommodation on measures that the government will be expecting all new students to take in terms of accommodation for the 14-day restricted movement period. So we will be communicating with you about this in the coming days. Trinity will be providing a lot of supports also and front-loading some of our orientation supports during that 14 days of restricted movement as well. So there will be online orientations and resources that will help you connect with other people and support you. The Global Room will be doing some events during those restricted movement weeks. And in Trinity Hall, for example, and on main campus, the SU or the JCR will be organising events as well to just keep you connected and make sure that you are supported during that period. So as I mentioned, Cavan Accord and Binary Hub are Trinity sites, but they're managed through a private operator. So they will be providing slightly different supports, but that will be similar to what Trinity is providing. So if you do have any questions on the specific supports offered by Cavan Accord and Binary Hub, you can contact them at the web addresses listed there. So I'm not going to dwell on private accommodation because it's going to be covered in the other presentations, but if you are going to be looking for private accommodation, Laura will tell you a lot more about that. But there are a number of places online that you can go and search for private accommodation as well. And these are some of the websites that we would recommend. And Stephen and Laura will talk to you about, some of the areas that you need to bear in mind when looking for private accommodation as well. So before I finish then, you might, if you're an incoming new international undergrad or a new international postgrad, you might not be aware that the Global Room runs some student Facebook groups. So if you want to join those groups, please do. If you're a continuing student and you're joining us today, if you're an international or an Irish student, please don't hesitate to contact any of us on the call today or contact the Global Room or the Accommodation Advisory Service for more information and stay in touch with us. So I hope that was useful and thank you for listening. And I'm going to pass you over now to my colleague, Stephen from Threshold, who is going to talk to you more on private accommodation and what you need to know. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks.
And we'll all be present for the Q&A session as well. I see that somebody has asked a question about Goldsmith Hall. Are applications still open? My understanding is that accommodation on main campus is currently all booked up and that it isn't open for applications anymore. However, if you want to contact the Trinity Accommodation Office directly to ask if there are any spaces, you can do that. So I hope I've answered that question, Hubab Sabir. So now we can go over to Stephen.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see the screen. Confirmation, thank you very much. Thank you for the invite to participate today. My name is Stephen and I work for a housing charity based in Dublin. It's called Threshold. You're obviously very well supported through the Global Room and Trinity College, but also we're there in the background if anyone during their stay needs any advice on their rented issues. In terms of student accommodation, there are quite a range of options available to you. As Louise has gone through there, primarily people are going to be accessing on-campus accommodation or purpose-built student accommodation. There are also other options out there, renting from a private landlord or indeed renting a room with a family, for example, and that's known as digs. Depending on where you're renting, there may be different rules that apply. So today's presentation will cover most of the key issues. This is a survey, it's a couple of years out of date now, but you can see that for the vast majority of students, they stay in either purpose-built student accommodation or private rented accommodation. Louise has given you the example of the on-campus accommodation in Trinity, and there are also an increase in number of purpose-built student accommodation. This is just an example of a private provider. It's not one used by Trinity, but it's just to give you an example what's out there. So purpose-built student accommodation, traditionally people would have signed up for a semester or for the year, and they would have paid in advance and entered into agreements in advance, and they were affected by the COVID measures as many institutions suspended lectures, etc. What we are seeing is that a lot of the purpose-built student accommodation providers out there now are putting in place plans to prepare for the return to college, but also to ensure that everyone's health and safety is at the forefront when people are returning. So they're introducing plans which will include the provision of protective equipment, deep cleaning, also providing quarantine support. So where people are coming into the country, providing, in many cases, they're providing free 14-day quarantine, and also more flexible booking arrangements. So in the past, it might have been quite an onerous undertaking in terms of your booking and being able to cancel or amend that booking. But given the pandemic, the providers are now more flexible in relation to that. So one of the options that is available to you if you're renting, it's known as digs. And I'm just going to quickly deal with digs because digs is basically where you rent a room. You may share with the family. You're living with the owner, and they may or may not provide various services as part of your stay. It's very important to know that if you do avail of this option, this is known as a license arrangement. And unfortunately, digs are outside of the normal landlord and tenant laws that apply, which we'll be going into now. So this traditionally, I suppose, would represent what it's like to try and find accommodation in Dublin, like any other international city. There's a very high demand for accommodation and very low supply, so it can be quite difficult to source accommodation, and it can be quite expensive. In terms of renting in Ireland, we have a main piece of legislation called the Residential Tenancies Act, and that is a very effective piece of legislation that covers your rights and your obligations, but also the rights and obligations of the landlord or agent that they have acting on their behalf. But it does have some limitations. Primarily, legislation doesn't kick in until you've established a tenancy, and that creates a lot of difficulties, particularly for students coming to Ireland for the first time. You may not be aware of the local local practices. There's nowhere for you, for example, to check in advance to see if the person is a landlord or authorised to actually let out the property. There's a lot of risk involved in sourcing accommodation at the moment. There is one piece that you can take from today's presentation. It's the third point here, that no one should ever agree to take a property without actually viewing it and ensuring that you're happy with the property and also the terms and conditions. You should always avoid paying in cash where possible and ensure you always get a receipt for any payments made. Once you have created your tenancy, then your landlord has certain responsibilities. They have to register that tenancy with a body called the Residential Tenancies Board, and they have a month from the start of your tenancy to do that. Private rented accommodation, it's also covered by what's known as equal status legislation, which aims to tackle discrimination in the provision of accommodation. We have 9 grounds upon which a person cannot be discriminated against in the provision of accommodation, and you cannot be discriminated against directly, indirectly, or by association. If a person has been subject to discrimination in the provision of accommodation, you can take further action. You can go to a body called the Workplace Relations Commission and take your case. And that is something that if people need help with doing, we can assist. Unfortunately, as I said, private rented accommodation, your rights really kick in once that tenancy has been established. Unfortunately, what happens before that is somewhat unregulated. And some people face a lot of difficulty in sourcing accommodation, and very often they may be asked for excessive amounts of information from a prospective landlord. Obviously, a provider needs to gather some information to be able to decide on who they're going to offer the property to, but the gathering of that information cannot exceed GDPR regulations, and it can't be used in a discriminatory way. Generally speaking, people will look for example, a reference if possible from a previous landlord, or if someone's in employment, a reference from their employer, and photo ID. Obviously, if a person is unhappy or doesn't want to provide that information, you shouldn't do so, and you should inquire as to the use of that information. And if you have any concerns at all, that can be reported to a body called the Data Protection Commission. Unfortunately, every year around this time, we have a lot of people looking for accommodation, and a lot of people, as I say, come to Ireland for the first time, not familiar with our rental laws, etc. And unfortunately, that creates a lot of risk. Threshold with the Union of Students of Ireland annually would launch a campaign. It's called Scam Watch, where we try to draw attention to the potential for people to be the victims of rental scams. So again, just to reiterate the point, no one should ever agree to take a property without properly viewing it, going physically to that property and ensuring that you're happy with the property, the terms and conditions, and the person offering it. If you have any concerns at all, you can contact all the supports that are available through Global Room, Trinity, and ourselves. If necessary, you can contact the Gardaí if you feel it's potentially a scam. If something looks too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. Best walk away. Very often you'll be asked to pay a deposit to secure a property from a private landlord. Currently, there's no law on how much the landlord can seek from you. Generally, it would be the equivalent of 1 month's rent. So when you're going to source property, you'll probably be expected to be able to provide a deposit, the equivalent of a month's rent, and usually 1 month's rent in advance. Can be asked for more. In some cases, that does happen, and currently that's not illegal from a landlord to do with it. We are actively campaigning for a definition of deposit, which would define it as 1 month's rent. And also, excuse me, whereby the deposit is held by a third party and not the landlord. Dublin, as an international city, as the nation's capital, accommodation can be scarce and accommodation can be expensive. We have 2 key sources where you can look for properties, one of which is daft.ie, and they will regularly produce reports, will give you an indication of the average rents or properties throughout the country. Currently, the average rent in Dublin is over €2,000 for a property, and there is a scarcity of accommodation. It is increasing, but albeit at a very small rate. And currently, there's approximately 2,500 private rented properties listed on daft.ie. Depending on where you're looking to live, you are going to probably expect variation in the rent. So if you're looking for a property that's quite close to Trinity, you're probably going to expect to pay more in rent than you would if you were living on the outskirts, for example, living in Dublin 15. And you can see there's a huge difference. For example, a one bed in Dublin 2, it's just over 1,900 per month, whereas a one bed in Dublin 15, it's just over 1,400 per month. So the closer you try to live to the city centre, the more rent you're going to have to pay. When you are renting, it's very important to know that there are rent control measures in place. So your rent can increase, but it can only go up by 4% every 12 months. And your landlord also has an obligation to inform you when your tenancy starts of how much your rent is, and that rent was set in accordance with the rent pressure zone rules. If you feel that's not the case, or you haven't been given that information, or you feel you're paying too much, you can report that to a body called the Residential Tenancies Board. So where you create a tenancy, you have a number of rights and obligations, and all of those are set out in law. One of which is that you have a right to peaceful occupation during your tenancy. So that means that the landlord cannot access the property without your permission. And if they do so, it is a breach. You can, unless you agree otherwise, have guests or visitors. And there's no law in relation to having pets. So in that situation, you can check your lease or negotiate locally with your landlord. Property that you'll be renting is covered by legislation. The landlord has to ensure that it meets basic minimum standards, that it's structurally sound, and it's quite heavily regulated. If you do have an issue and the landlord's not carrying out repairs, Threshold can intervene on your behalf to try and negotiate for those repairs to be carried out. But if necessary, you can report that to your local authority. In many instances, you will be seeking to share accommodation with other students, and that can be quite challenging because very often in shared accommodation, it will involve compromise, and some of the disputes that do arise are not necessarily covered by the legislation. So it's very important, if you are entering into a shared scenario, that you come up with some kind of house rules that everyone agrees to. So the house rules, they'll cover things like the bills, like are there kitties for things like food, for cleaning products, etc. In terms of expectations around noise, etc. Where a person sharing with a landlord, unfortunately, this means that they're outside of the protection of the legislation that we've been covering. Again, as with bigs, this is known as a license arrangement, and it's a completely unregulated sector. It's basically up to the provider. So if you move into a property and the landlord is living there, you have very minimal rights. And that person could, for example, they could ask you to leave at any stage. You're not entitled to some of the things that a normal tenant would be provided with. For example, a rent book or controls in relation to how your rent is set or how that arrangement can be ended. There are very specific rules coming towards the end of the tenancy that your landlord has to end that tenancy on certain grounds. And they also, depend on how long you're living in the property, they need to give you the relevant period of notice. If you sign a lease, for example, a contract for 12 months, then normally you cannot give notice during that unless you and the landlord agree at the time, or you find someone to replace yourself. And if you do have any dispute in relation to how the tenancy is being ended, again, that can be disputed by going to the Residential Tenancies Board. Through these. Sometimes during the tenancy, you may, for example, may have to return home, or you may be sent on a placement elsewhere. So generally speaking, where you have a fixed term agreement, you can't pass that tenancy on to someone else without the landlord's consent. If you do break a fixed term agreement, you need to be aware that there could be potential penalties in relation to having deductions made from the deposit or a deposit retained, and you could also be charged for any rent outstanding on that agreement. So it's very important that if you're in a shared scenario and you have a fixed term agreement and you do have to leave for whatever reason, that seeking a replacement that is discussed with the provider. And then for many students, the big issue is at the end of a tenancy, how to get back the deposit that you paid. Unfortunately, when you're looking for accommodation, you have to turn up and you need the deposit in advance and you need the rent in advance. That's not reciprocated at the end when you're leaving. So the landlord doesn't currently have to give you back the deposit that you paid at the end of your tenancy. They're allowed what's called a reasonable period of time within which to do that. And there's no technical requirement for a landlord to conduct a final walkthrough with you in the property, although that is recommended. Where you are leaving the property, it's vital that you ensure that all the rent is paid and all the bills are paid in advance, and that you remove the property and just give the property a quick clean to the best of your ability. There's no need for you to engage professional cleaners. Take photographs to show the condition of the property that you returned it in. And all that may be necessary should you have to take further action in getting back your deposit. Again, that would go to the Residential Tenancies Board, and that is something, again, where people experience difficulties in getting back their deposit, we can assist with. So I've mentioned a couple of times a body called the Residential Tenancies Board. The Residential Tenancies Board were set up under the legislation, the Residential Tenancies Act, and they're set up to offer a dispute resolution mechanism if a landlord and tenant have an issue that cannot be resolved informally. It's a relatively inexpensive process. You don't need legal representation. You can have help if you wish. Threshold would often assist people in going to the RTB, and it costs €15 to take a case to the RTB online. And that's the end of my presentation. So I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Thanks very much, Stephen. That was really interesting and informative. And also to mention to everybody that, so as Stephen spent a bit of time talking about private accommodation, some of the rules and regulations in relation to student accommodation will be slightly different. So just to bear in mind that there are those differences. So now we're going to move on to Laura, if she's ready, from the Accommodation Advisory Service in Trinity, representing the Students' Union. So Laura, you're presenting, aren't you, with a presentation? So if you want to try sharing your screen, Stephen, if you stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, sure.
Great. So over to you now, Laura. Great, we can see that, Laura.
Great. I'm just trying to get into the presentation mode. Okay. Okay, so like mentioned, my name is Laura, and I am I'm the accommodation officer with the Trinity College Students' Union. So we run an accommodation advisory service every year. It does run all of the time, like I'm in the office all of the time, but it's not like a full-time position. It runs full-time, usually August, September, and then again in January. But if you need any help at any time during the year, you just get in touch, and we might take a little bit longer to get back to you, but we'll get back to you whenever you need us. So as you can see from this map, we're located in House 6, which is right next to the front arch of Trinity. So you come in through the front gate and we're on the left-hand side there. And now with the COVID-19 restrictions, you're not allowed to actually use this gate at the minute, I don't think. So you just come in through Nassau Street, which is here, and you just still come through, and we're still right there. We're easy to find. And like I said, we're fully staffed in August and September, and again in January. But again, if you need us, we are here throughout the year. And if it's a particularly urgent issue, you just get in touch with the Students' Union Welfare Officer. Her name this year is Leah Kyo, and her email address you can find on the website. It's just welfare@tcdsu.org. So what we do is we're there to give support to you when you're looking for accommodation off campus. A lot of people come to us with questions just about accommodation in general, whether that's on campus or off campus, and we're usually able to give you advice to the best of our ability, no matter what questions you have, but we would usually refer you to the on-campus accommodation office, usually because they would be the experts in that, so we're there for the off-campus accommodation. We try to act as a link between landlords and students. So we often have landlords who will want to advertise their properties with us. Like Stephen mentioned, digs, which is where you rent a room in an owner-occupied home. So we're there to like help you find those kind of places. And if you have any questions about like living in digs and your experience in digs, we're there to give you advice with that. But then also if landlords have issues with their students, they'll usually get in touch with us as well. We give you advice on house hunting, on viewings, the rental process. We publish a guide every year called Living in Dublin, which has some information on the different areas in Dublin, on what to expect when you're renting a house, what to expect when you're looking at a house, and what to expect from digs and the provider of digs. We also run a Facebook group, which we try to help you find roommates, and the Facebook group is one of the best ways to do that. So it's called TCDSU Accommodation Support. I think I have it later on in the slides. But basically, if you join that group, you'll see like loads of Trinity students, both Irish students and international students, who are there to who might also be looking for housemates or looking for people to help each other find rooms. You might make some friends in there if you don't know anyone in Ireland yet. It's a nice group to join. I highly recommend it. A lot of students, if they had a house for the last academic year and maybe they got on campus this year, or they're moving to a different city, their house might become available. They often will post in that Facebook group before going to other places to say, oh, I have a room, my room is available if anybody wants to take over my lease. So it's definitely a good group to be a part of. There are lots of Facebook groups for accommodation in Dublin. I'm sure you've seen some of them. I would be a bit more cautious with some of the others. Our Facebook group is nice because you know that it's other students. We monitor it very closely. Again, you have to be very careful using social media when you're looking for a property in Dublin. You have to be really extra careful. But again, like I said, it's a good group to join. I do highly recommend joining it. So this has already been touched on, but the three different types of accommodation that most students end up in would be either private rentals, private student accommodation, which sometimes is called PBSA, purpose-built student accommodation, and digs accommodation. So like you saw in Stephen's slides, the majority of students would end up in the purpose-built student accommodation, whether that's Trinity Hall, Cabinet Court, Binary Hub, and there are loads of other providers like companies like Aparto, Uninest, Fresh. There's loads of providers in Dublin. They're great options. They're really handy because they're so close to college, and it's nice that everything is all paid for. You have an ensuite room and you pay in usually 2 or 3 installments, and then you don't have to worry about it. But the issue with it is that it can be more expensive than other options. So sometimes it's not an option for everyone to consider. But then we have private rentals. That's where you find a house with your friends, or even if you don't know them, hopefully they will become your friends. You find a house and you rent, and the owner of the house does not live in the house with you. And then digs is where you rent a room in the house and then the owner is living in the house with you. So let me go on. Trinity Hall, Binary Hub, they're all the different options of the private student accommodation. There are more than those. This is just a basic list. There are lots of other options, and again, they are great to consider. It's just that they can be quite expensive. And the one thing I will say, actually, in light of recent times with the COVID-19 pandemic, when it comes to the private student accommodation, make sure that you understand what the cancellation process is with them, because if there's a second wave and if Trinity decides to go entirely online for the academic year, you need to make sure that you know what the student accommodations plan is for that. Will they be okay with refunding you the money, or will they expect you to still pay the whole thing even if you're not there? So it's definitely important to be aware of that. So this is our website. It's an old-fashioned looking website. It's not very modern, but it does the job. This now, if you have a TCD email address, you can just make an account here in the students section. If you don't have your TCD email address yet, you can get in touch with me and I'll give you temporary login details. You just have to prove that you are a TCD, you're an incoming student. The one thing I'll say about our website is that it tends to only have digs on it. It's only where you rent a room in the owner-occupied house. So if that's not something you're willing to consider at all, then there won't be a huge amount of options available on our website. But if you're okay with digs, then there's usually like a load of people advertising there, so it's well worth checking out. So this is where a lot of, this is the different areas in Dublin that students end up renting in. Some of them are more desirable than others, but then some of them are more expensive than others. So Trinity is located in Dublin too, which is there. And obviously if you got anywhere there, like that would be super handy and super close to college, but it would be quite expensive. So that's the other thing to note. I think when you're looking for accommodation, it's important to try and get somewhere that's an easy commute to college. Anywhere on a Dart line, a Lewis line, or a good bus service will be nice. The Lewis and the Dart is nicer because it doesn't have to deal with traffic in the morning. The bus, you definitely have to be careful of traffic. Dublin 6 here is where Trinity Hall is located. So a lot of students like to live in this area because they like to live amongst the other Trinity students. But really, Dublin 6, Dublin 8 is where Binary Hub is, and Dublin 1 is where Kavanagh Court is. So those are just some areas that you might be interested in. And again, I can send out an email. I have a more detailed breakdown of all the different locations. So if you want a really in-depth discussion about it, you can email me. My email address will be listed at the end of the email, at the end of this presentation. In House 6, which is where I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which is where we operate out of, that's where you can get your LEAP card. So you need a LEAP card if you're traveling around Dublin. You'll be very lucky if you got somewhere within walking distance of Trinity, so you more than likely will have to be using public transportation. Public transportation in Dublin, it can be expensive, but it's significantly reduced in price with the LEAP card, so definitely that's something you're going to want to get yourself set up with once you make it to Dublin in August or September. So here's a checklist of what you should be aware of when you're doing a viewing. Like has been said many times over the course of this webinar, we highly recommend that you do a viewing in person of a house before you pay any money. You need to be aware that you need to make sure it's not a scam, and you need to make sure that you're happy with the location and with the house. You need to make sure that it's not damp, that it's got good ventilations, and all of these other things that we've listed out here. I won't read through every single one of them because there's so many. But again, we made a booklet, a PDF booklet, where we have this listed in more detail. So again, it's available on our website, but if you want to email me, you can email me and I will send it on to you. So here's a little breakdown of the service we provide in the Accommodation Advisory Service. We're not able to plead your case with the on-campus accommodation officers. So unfortunately, as has been mentioned, on campus, the application process has closed, and it has been closed for a while now. So a lot of the rooms have already been given out. In fact, all of the rooms have already been given out. They are operating waiting lists, particularly for Trinity Hall. If you're a first year incoming student, undergraduate student, if you haven't already gotten in touch with Trinity Hall to be asked to ask them to put you on the waiting list, you should definitely do that. There's a small chance you could get put in halls, but it's not a huge chance. But yeah, if you've been rejected from campus, unfortunately, we're not able to help you, improve your chances of getting on campus or getting reconsidered. Again, we're also not able to do the search for you. We'll provide you with every support we possibly can, but we won't be able to sit down and go through the websites with you or go to viewings with you. And we're also not like a magic unfortunately, I wish I did have magic powers where I could just grant everyone a house, but I'm not able to do that. But in every other way that we can possibly support you, whether it's even like emotional support when you're feeling feeling lost when you're searching, we're there. You can email, or you can, if once campus is open again after the pandemic, you can call into us. But in the meantime, we check the email every day and we aim to get back as quickly as possible. So please don't hesitate to get in touch if you do have any questions. I'd be more than happy to help you out as much as I can. And that's me. So that's my email address there, accommodation@tcdsu.org. You can't actually ring us at the moment because I'm not in the office. We're shut down. But do email if you have any questions at all. There's no question that's silly at all. Like, I love helping, I love giving advice. So please do email and get in touch, okay? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That's fantastic. And I feel very reassured by all of the information that we're getting. So I hope the students do as well. So I'm going to pass over now to Michelle Hogan, who's going to run the Q&A piece. So over to you, Michelle.
Okay, so we have a few questions coming in, excuse me, and we have a couple of ambassadors that are going to help answer them. Excuse me again. And a couple of them have had to source their own accommodation, and have actually also had to help other students as well in the global room, and also friends of theirs. So we've got a few different angles. So Mark, do you want to start off with the questions first?
Yes, so just a question. So will the recordings be uploaded to TCD's website?
We will definitely have them on our social media pages, and we'll email everybody with them. So I'm not sure whether we'll have it up on the TCD website itself, but we will be emailing all of the recordings that we were doing, not just for this Q&A, but for all the other ones on immigration and the subsequent ones that we're going to do.
Okay, so what's your advice for, because how can we do the viewing when we need to quarantine?
I do think that's going to be quite challenging. It's Louise here. That is going to be challenging. So the student who's asked that, it would be interesting to know if they could reply in the chat whether they're a new student or whether they're an Irish student or well, they're an international student, I guess. There are some measures going to be put in place over the next month, and more advice will be issuing from Trinity soon around supports for quarantining, or the self-restricted movement period. The terminology keeps on changing. So we will be able to advise students a little bit more on that. It looks like there may be support measures put in place to provide students with accommodation in which they can restrict their movement for that 2-week period, and we will be advising of that over the coming month. But yes, it is important to note, and I'm glad that a student has actually mentioned this, that during the restricted movement period, it does mean restrict your movement. So traveling around the city looking for accommodation or going to viewings would not be feasible. So it will certainly create some complications, but we will advise through our various services what we recommend over the coming few weeks. It will be quite quickly. We will be advising on that. I hope that answers the question.
Louise, if I could just, I suppose, share the wider experience in the private rental sector. During the pandemic measures, whilst movements were restricted, there have been some movements, and in some cases, providers have organised virtual viewings, which, you know, it's probably in the current climate, it's probably a happy medium. You know, you're still getting a live walk through the property with the provider.
Great.
So that might be something that can be organised with whether it's, you know, individually with the landlord or someone's going through an agency. Many of the agencies already have measures like that in place.
Great. That's really, really good to know. That's not something that we had heard of. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Okay, so with regards to, so if virtual viewing is unavailable, what would you advise students with regards to visiting an accommodation viewing when they first arrive into Ireland?
Well, I think as Stephen just said there, it won't be possible for them to view summer straight away when they arrive into Ireland, because they are supposed to be restricting their movement for 14 days. So as I said, Trinity will be advising on accommodation for that 14-day restricted movement period. Now, if you are already booked into or accepted or have applied to any of the Trinity sites, you will be covered because your accommodation will be provided during those 14 days. It's a little bit more complicated if you are arriving and then going to be looking for accommodation. But as I said, we're just getting new government advice this week on how student accommodation is going to be managed, or students coming for those 14 days of restricted movement. So we will be able to update people on that over the coming weeks. And probably in the next week, they will be hearing from us.
Those seem to be the two questions that popped up.
Okay, great. Can I ask Mark and Tanmai, where have you lived in Dublin, and what has your experience been like?
We also have pre-TAM on as well.
Oh, we have pre-TAM as well. Okay, great.
So from Mark's experience, he's more kind of assisted in the global room with the type of queries that's came in. So if you...
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, that's right, yes.
Yeah.
Hi Pritam, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
So Tanmai, do you want to start off first then and talk about what your experience has been like?
So I moved to Ireland in 2017, and in my first year, as most of the international undergrads do, I stayed at Trinity Halls. Again, it was a great experience which I had there. Then in my second year, I stayed in Broadstone Hall, which is a private student accommodation, which is located in Dublin 7. So it was about 2 kilometers from Trinity, and it was accessible by both bus as well as DART. So it was, I think, a 5-minute, bus as well as the Lewis. I think it was a 5-minute Lewis ride. So that was a private student accommodation. It wasn't exclusively for Trinity students. So you had students from various different colleges who stayed over there. Like you had students from DIT, you had students from UCD, you had students from NCI. So, but it was an only students accommodation. Then last year, which was my third year, I stayed at Kavanagh Court, which is again a Trinity affiliated accommodation. Now, Kavanagh Court was a lot more convenient for me because I could walk to college, because I think it's just like 1.8 kilometers from university. And it was like, the location is very, it's a very handy location, I'd say, because you again have a Lewis stop nearby, and it's quite near the city center. Like you have many shops around Kavanagh Court. So I have mainly stayed in student accommodation so far. And I have had a very nice experience because a lot of things are taken care of in student accommodations. Like you have to pay separate bills for your Wi-Fi, for your electricity, and you don't have to worry about particular days to dispose of your garbage. Like, for instance, all my friends who stay in a private accommodation, they can only dispose of garbage on select days in a week, and that too in select bags which they have to go and purchase. So there are a lot of things which are taken care of in a student accommodation, and I've been very happy and comfortable in student accommodation so far.
Yeah, those are some great points. And I think, sometimes when we look at the high cost of some of the purpose-built student accommodation, we do sometimes forget about the fact that it does cover elements like that you mentioned about garbage collection that end up being additional, more hidden costs when you're staying in private accommodation. Pritam, do you want to tell us a little bit about where you have stayed and what your experience has been?
Yes, so in my third year, so I joined Trinity in my third year. So I initially stayed at the Trinity Halls, and that was actually an amazing experience. I met many people, and the whole transition was really amazing with the JCR over there. And in my next year, I stayed at Kavanagh Courts. That was a pretty convenient spot for me because it was near to my part-time and our college. And the whole transportation issue was not there, which we faced in Trinity Halls, and we could just walk to the college. And for the coming year, I'm looking to outsource for a private apartment. So since I've already been in a campus accommodation and a private accommodation, so I'm gonna take the field of a apartment with a few of my friends, and we're working on sourcing that out.
Okay, good. That sounds great. So it seems like you've had very positive experiences staying in some of the private or purpose-built accommodation like Kavanagh Court and also in Trinity Hall. So as we mentioned in the presentation, Kavanagh Court, the applications I think are still open, but it is largely full at this point. So, but if you are interested, I would say, you know, apply immediately. Binary Hub, I know, still does have rooms available and would be very broadly similar to Kavanagh Court in a slightly different area of the city, but still within a 20-minute walk of Trinity, or a run or a cycle would be obviously shorter. It would really only take you about 10 minutes to get to Trinity on a bike from there. We are approaching nearly the end of time. Does anyone have any final questions or any additional points that any of the speakers, Laura or Stephen, would like to make, or Abby or Michelle, or any of the ambassadors? Any final closing notes for anybody?
No, just be aware that all the supports are available to you. Even if you didn't get to see all of the presentations and you still have questions that you might not have gotten to ask today, we are still available. You can contact us as TCD Global Room at tcd.ie, and we'll try to help you out.
Absolutely.
Also, just another couple of points. We've several Facebook groups for new incoming students that you can join. We'll put up links to them today, which we recommend going on and kind of linking up with some other people to help you in your search. Because obviously one part of this process is finding accommodation, but it's a little bit easier if you're kind of sharing the load with other people that have common kind of interests. And obviously it'd be nice to share with somebody that you've made a connection with, but I'm sure not all of our Trinity students are lovely. So even if you stay with them and a lot of people, other students around Dublin, hopefully you'll have a great experience. And if you have any questions, you know, you can Facebook or Instagram us, as well as email, and as Abby said. And, you know, we might get some ambassadors to talk about or do blogs and kind of their experiences around sharing with other students and kind of compromises, which kind of Stephen was mentioning earlier, because there's kind of finding accommodation, but then there's kind of the experience beyond that, which we're aware of.
Absolutely, yeah. So some of the references to the Facebook groups were in my presentation as well, so you can see those. And I think Laura also mentioned the SU Advisory Service sharing group as well, so you can join that too.
We can also send all of those, sorry to cut across you, Louise, with the presentation as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So one final thing, we're very happy that everyone was here today, and for any of the students who are participating in the call, we will be sending you just a follow-up questionnaire to just see if we answered your queries and if you felt that the content was sufficient for you. So look, we'll bring this to an end now. Thank you everyone for speaking. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Laura, Tanmay, Mark, Pritam, and of course my colleagues from the Global Room. It's been lovely being with you, and best of luck with your accommodation search. And as we've all said, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Laura mentioned we don't have magic powers when it comes to finding accommodation for you, but we'll certainly do our best and share our experiences. So thanks a lot, and we'll finish up now. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye.
Bye, everyone.